She wasn't supposed to be there, not on that dock, not near that ship. Certainly not within sight of the USS Harry S. Truman. One of the most secure and classified aircraft carriers in the entire U.S. Navy fleet, but Martha Caldwell had no idea that her morning walk was about to turn into a national incident. If you think HOA drama is wild, wait until you hear what happened when a quiet woman unknowingly walked into a restricted Navy zone and found herself face-to-face with armed military police. This story spirals from confusion to confrontation, and just when you think it's over, the Admiral steps in, and everything stops. You're watching Sham Stories. Make sure to subscribe for more jaw-dropping drama like this one. It all began on a misty Thursday morning when Martha, a widowed 54-year-old who spent her days volunteering at the local animal shelter and helping elderly neighbors with grocery runs, decided to take a different path along the waterfront during her morning stroll. She had just moved to Norfolk, Virginia, to be closer to her daughter, who was stationed at a nearby naval hospital, and knew very little about the heavy military presence surrounding the city. The winding footpath near the shipyard had no obvious signs, no barbed wire fences, and no uniformed guards in immediate view, just a few fading no trespassing signs that had been obscured by overgrown shrubs and weather damage. Martha walked through an open gate that seemed like it led to a public pier and wandered closer, fascinated by the massive silhouette of the USS Truman in the morning fog. She stood there in awe, watching sailors march along the flight deck, and even took out her phone to snap a few pictures, mesmerized by the sheer scale of the aircraft carrier. That was the moment when everything changed. To military police, officers emerged from a hidden security booth and shouted for her to put the phone down. Confused and startled, Martha dropped the device and raised her hands instinctively, unsure what she had done wrong. The officers approached with speed and precision, barking commands and circling her like she was a genuine threat. She tried to tell them she was just out for a walk. She didn't see any signs, that she meant no harm, but her words were drowned out by the barked orders and the cold clink of handcuffs snapping around her wrists. She wasn't read her rights. She wasn't given time to call anyone. She was hauled off the pier like a prisoner of war and taken into a reinforced security office at the edge of the naval base. Her arms were trembling, her heart was pounding, and tears streamed down her face as the realization dawned that no one knew where she was. Inside the security room, a stern-faced officer named Lieutenant Mason Harper glared at her through mirrored sunglasses. Flipping through her ID and checking her name against a government database. "What were you doing near the Truman?" asked, his voice like ice. "Who sent you?" Martha was too stunned to respond. "I was just walking," she repeated softly. "I didn't know I wasn't allowed there. I didn't see any signs." But they weren't interested in her excuses. They grilled her for nearly an hour, interrogating her about her background, her reason for moving to Norfolk, and even about her daughter, Captain Lisa Caldwell, who happened to be one of the trauma surgeons stationed at Naval Medical Center, Portsmouth. The name struck a nerve with one of the junior officers, who whispered something urgently into Harper's ear. He stiffened and looked down at the woman in front of him with a mixture of confusion and unease. "You're Lisa Caldwell's mother?" he asked, a sudden shift in tone betraying his earlier aggression. "Yes," Martha said quietly. "I just moved here last month." Another whispered conversation followed behind closed doors, and soon the tension in the room skyrocketed. Apparently, Lisa Caldwell had recently been recognized for saving the life of a high-ranking officer's son during an emergency operation, earning her serious respect across the base. And now her mother was sitting in handcuffs, accused of trespassing near one of the most heavily guarded warships in the country. Lieutenant Harper left the room to make a call, one that went straight up the chain of command. What happened next would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. The Admiral of the Atlantic Fleet, Admiral Raymond Knox, was on board the Truman that morning for a classified inspection tour. When he heard about a civilian woman being arrested at the dock, especially the mother of the doctor who had saved his godson's life, he ordered the arrest report sent directly to him. At first, he assumed it was just a minor breach of protocol. Maybe someone had ignored signage. Maybe there was confusion at the gate. But when he saw the footage, when he saw the face of a terrified, crying older woman being handcuffed and shoved into a holding room, something inside him snapped. "Get me Harper," he barked. "Now." The phone rang in the security office and Harper picked up. The second he heard who was on the line, his face turned ghost white. "Sir, yes, I understand," he stammered. "Yes, I'll release her immediately." But the Admiral wasn't finished. "I want her escorted personally, and I want a full report on why your perimeter signage is unreadable." "She didn't trespass. You failed to notify the public." Harper looked like he'd swallowed a rock. He rushed back into the room, fumbled with the cuffs, and released Martha, apologizing under his breath, but never quite meeting her eyes. Senior officers were called in to escort her home, apologizing profusely and offering to carry her bags as she wiped the tears from her eyes. But something had shifted in Martha and in Admiral Knox. A line had been crossed, and it wasn't going to be so easily ignored. What none of them knew yet was that this minor misunderstanding would soon explode into a storm of internal investigations, political finger-pointing, and even threats from DC officials. What had started as a quiet walk was now on its way to becoming a public scandal, and the people responsible for what happened to Martha Caldwell weren't going to stay in the shadows for long. By the time Martha Caldwell arrived back at her small townhouse in the outskirts of Norfolk, she was still shaking, her wrists sore from the tight cuffs and her mind spinning from the surreal horror of being treated like a criminal by her own country's military. The two officers who escorted her had tried to smooth things over with soft voices and respectful distance. But their discomfort only made the silence heavier. Once they left her at the front porch with a muttered apology and a nervous backward glance, she sat on her couch and stared blankly at the wall for hours. She didn't even notice the tea she had poured growing cold on the kitchen counter. Meanwhile, inside the halls of power surrounding the USS Truman, Admiral Raymond Knox wasn't letting the incident die quietly. He had served in the Navy for nearly 3 decades and had seen firsthand how bureaucracy and negligence could spiral into injustice. But something about this case stung deeper. He knew Lisa Caldwell, her reputation as a trauma surgeon had preceded her. He had even attended the award ceremony when she was honored for her life-saving operation on Commander Riley's teenage son. And the look of pride in her eyes when she mentioned her sweet, hard-working mom had stuck with him. That woman in the interrogation footage, the one crying, handcuffed, confused, was the same mother. And while the base's lawyers were already scrambling to bury the incident as a misunderstanding, Knox knew this wasn't over. He demanded a full inquiry into perimeter signage failures, access control lapses, and the behavior of Lieutenant Harper, who had been responsible for detaining Martha in the first place. Harper, in turn, grew defensive and bitter, claiming he was just following procedure and that the Admiral was overreacting to a harmless breach. But others on the base had seen the footage too, and they didn't see it as harmless. They saw a woman who had walked past broken signs into what looked like a public dock, only to be treated like a foreign saboteur. Within 24 hours, Lisa Caldwell got the call first from her commanding officer, then from Admiral Knox himself. She listened, stunned, as Knox apologized to her directly and explained what had happened to her mother. Her face went pale with anger, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she drove straight to her mother's house, barely pausing to knock before pulling Martha into a hug. "Why didn't you call me?" she whispered. "I didn't want to cause you trouble," Martha replied, her voice hoarse. I thought maybe I did something wrong." Lisa's fists clenched and she sat with her mother all night, listening to every detail, the barking orders, the cold cuffs, the way no one believed her or even listened. That weekend, Lisa made a formal complaint to the Office of Naval Inspector General, invoking her right as both an officer and a relative of a civilian improperly detained on base. The report included timestamps, locations, footage, and even photos Lisa herself took of the broken, overgrown, no trespassing signs along the fence line. The Inspector General's office began reviewing the complaint immediately, but news of the internal turmoil began to leak. First, a whisper among officers, then a mention in an internal newsletter, and finally, a bold anonymous post on a popular military forum, claiming the Navy had illegally detained an innocent civilian on a U.S. base and tried to cover it up. That post went viral within hours, triggering social media outrage and drawing the attention of a local investigative journalist named Thomas Briggs. Briggs was known for his no-nonsense style and history of exposing misconduct in both civilian and military institutions. When he showed up at Martha's doorstep with a notebook, a press badge, and a quiet, respectful voice, she nearly turned him away. But Lisa insisted it was time the truth came out. For 2 hours, Briggs sat in the Caldwell living room and listened. He didn't push. He didn't sensationalize. Just let Martha speak, occasionally jotting down notes as she recounted how she had wandered into the dock area by mistake, only to be handcuffed, interrogated, and released like a shadow. By the time he left, his jaw was clenched. He published the piece 2 days later under the headline, "Walking While Innocent Navy Detains Local. Widow and Security Blunder." The story exploded.
Oh.
Within hours, it was being quoted on cable, news, local radio, and online forums across the country. The article included side-by-side images, one of the overgrown gate she had walked through, one of Martha's red wrists after the cuffs were removed, and a still frame from the leaked footage showing her surrounded by armed men while she tried to explain herself. The Navy Public Affairs Office went into immediate damage control, releasing a statement that claimed the situation had been a misunderstanding and that proper protocols were followed. But the public wasn't buying it. Politicians began demanding answers. Several civil rights organizations issued statements of concern. Calls flooded into the base, demanding disciplinary action. Then came the subpoena. Congress wanted Admiral Knox, Lieutenant Harper, and several other officers involved to testify before a subcommittee about security policy, signage responsibilities, and detainment procedures involving civilians. Suddenly, this wasn't just a local scandal, it had become a national issue. Martha, terrified by all the attention, tried to step back, but it was too late. Her face was on the news, her name was trending online, and now powerful people in Washington were watching. Lisa, on the other hand, stood tall beside her mother, refusing to back down. "You served this country by raising me," she told her. "Now it's time the country protects you the way it should." The congressional hearing was scheduled within the month, and Knox, while cooperative, made it clear in private that he intended to defend Martha and expose every systemic failure that led to her wrongful detainment. But behind the scenes, tensions were rising. Lieutenant Harper had retained a private attorney and was reportedly preparing to file a countersuit against the Navy for professional defamation, claiming he was being made a scapegoat for broader systemic issues. Meanwhile, military contractors responsible for base signage were quietly attempting to shift blame onto Navy engineers. And internal emails showed a pattern of complaints about poor perimeter maintenance that had gone ignored for years. The deeper investigators dug, the more rot they uncovered. And all of it traced back to a single quiet woman who had gone for a walk one misty morning and happened to stop and admire a ship she didn't know she wasn't supposed to approach. What started as a quiet violation had erupted into a full-blown accountability crisis. And with every passing day, more eyes turned toward the Navy's leadership, demanding to know how a base that prided itself on vigilance had allowed such a basic failure to result in a national scandal. What no one knew yet, what even Admiral Knox hadn't realized, was that one of the contractors tasked with maintaining the pier perimeter had flagged the signage issue months earlier, filing a formal complaint that was buried by mid-level officers seeking to avoid budget cuts. Buried along with it was evidence that would soon surface: emails, inspection reports, and a whistleblower memo that named names. But that revelation was still to come, and for now, Martha Caldwell found herself caught in the eye of a growing storm. By the time the congressional subcommittee convened in Washington, D.C., the Martha Caldwell incident had become one of the most widely discussed domestic accountability cases tied to the military in over a decade. The USS Truman Base scandal had spiraled well beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a morning walk gone wrong had peeled back a thick layer of systemic negligence, poor oversight, and suppressed warnings. The chamber was packed with reporters, camera crews, civilian observers, and representatives from multiple government watchdog organizations. When Admiral Raymond Knox entered in full uniform, his face calm but steeled with purpose, He took his seat at the witness table alongside 3 other high-ranking officials, and just a few chairs down, Lieutenant Mason Harper sat stiffly beside his attorney, jaw clenched, his reputation teetering on the edge of collapse. The questioning began slowly. Focused first on base protocols: who was responsible for perimeter security, what kind of signage was maintained, how often it was inspected, and why the pier gate Martha had wandered through had been left open. With no guard posted, Knox answered with clarity and gravity, stating that in his view, the failure was both operational and ethical. And he didn't hesitate to admit that command had been informed of the signage issue months before the incident. Gasps murmured through the room when he revealed that internal memos dating back 6 months had documented not only poor signage but also malfunctioning motion sensors and blind zones in the surveillance grid failures that, had they been addressed, could have prevented the entire situation. A hush fell over the room when Knox turned directly to the committee and said, "We failed a civilian because we allowed complacency and fear of bureaucratic punishment to override safety and common sense. The fact that Mrs. Caldwell was arrested is not just a matter of broken protocol, it's a moral failure. And I will not defend it." That statement triggered a media frenzy. Lieutenant Harper's attorney pounced during the next round, accusing Knox of deflecting blame and sacrificing lower-ranking officers to preserve his own reputation. But under cross-examination, Knox produced a printed copy of a buried contractor report filed 3 months before the incident, which specifically warned about faded signage and faulty access control in the pier sector. The report had been acknowledged by Harper in an email, marked reviewed and tabled pending budget consideration. That single email, retrieved by the Inspector General's digital forensics team, detonated like a bomb in the hearing room. One of the committee members, Representative Lillian Ross, leaned forward and asked Harper point blank, "Are you saying you knew about the security vulnerabilities and chose not to act?" Harper's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. Harper's defense of just following orders began to crumble. Outside the chamber, the media ran wild with the headline, "Admiral drops bombshell, blames officer who ignored security warnings." Meanwhile, Martha, who had been advised not to attend the hearing to avoid public spectacle, remained at home watching the live stream with Lisa beside her. She flinched every time her name was mentioned, tears welling up as she saw her daughters. Hands tremble with anger. Lisa had been summoned to testify the following day as a key witness, not only to recount her mother's treatment, but also to verify the timeline of events after the incident and speak to the Navy's internal response. When she took the stand, she was a portrait of quiet fury, wearing her dress whites and standing tall before the committee. Her voice was steady as she described her mother's character, her own service history, and the horror of watching a woman who had never broken a law in her life treated like an intruder. "My mother volunteers at shelters, walks dogs, and bakes pies for neighbors," she said. "She wandered through an open gate with no warning signs and ended up in handcuffs, interrogated like a spy. If it can happen to her, it can happen to anyone." Her testimony sparked a wave of public empathy, especially among veterans, military families, and civil liberties advocates. But as the hearings continued, a deeper and more disturbing truth began to emerge. A whistleblower who had initially contacted the Inspector General's office anonymously came forward publicly under whistleblower protection laws. His name was Richard Elkins, civilian contractor who had been responsible for routine inspections at multiple naval installations, including the Truman Pier area. He provided documented proof that he had filed 2 separate alerts about the signage issue, both of which were dismissed by base administrative officers. One report even included photos taken weeks before the incident, showing the exact gate Martha had walked through, its warning sign half torn, the words "No trespassing" barely legible under vines and corrosion. He testified that his attempts to escalate the issue had been suppressed, and that mid-level officers had discouraged him from making waves during an ongoing cost-cutting initiative. The revelation ignited bipartisan outrage on the committee, and suddenly, the incident was no longer just about Martha or even Harper. It became a full-blown reckoning for how the military handled base safety, ignored contractor input, and enforced policies with disproportionate aggression when embarrassed. Meanwhile, back on the Truman itself, morale was faltering. Sailors who had once respected Harper now whispered about his downfall, and officers walked on eggshells, unsure whether they might be next in the cascade of accountability. The Navy launched a parallel internal review of its access control procedures across multiple bases, and Knox ordered all signage, surveillance, and checkpoint configurations audited within 30 days, a sweeping overhaul that sent shockwaves through every branch of Naval Command. But even with accountability spreading and systems changing, Martha's life wasn't returning to normal. She began receiving anonymous letters, some supportive, others filled with hate from conspiracy theorists who believed she had intentionally sparked the scandal for attention or political gain. She stopped going to the grocery store during the day. The woman who once loved her morning walks now peeked out windows before stepping onto her own front porch. Lisa took on extra security measures, even asking a Navy friend in cyber defense to monitor online threats. Through it all, Martha kept asking the same quiet question. I didn't do anything wrong, so why does it feel like I'm being punished? Again, that question haunted Knox as well, especially as pressure mounted from the Pentagon and civilian oversight boards demanding a scapegoat. Though Harper had clearly failed to act on security warnings, there was growing concern that the Navy would use him as a convenient fall guy and avoid confronting the broader cultural rot that allowed the incident to happen. In response, Knox began pushing for a complete overhaul of civilian engagement policy, including clearer signage standards, real-time monitoring of security reports, and formal training for all base personnel on de-escalation during civilian encounters. He called it the Caldwell Protocol. The proposal met resistance. Some commanders grumbled that it was an overreaction. Others feared the political optics, but Knox persisted. He wasn't trying to save his career. He was trying to fix something he now saw as deeply broken. By the end of the third week, the Caldwell Protocol was under formal review by Navy Command, and both House and Senate subcommittees had added it to the list of recommended reforms. Meanwhile, the Inspector General's final report was nearing release, and sources close to the investigation hinted it would be damning not just for Harper, but for several officers above him who had ignored or suppressed risk assessments. Tied to base access, Knox knew the moment of reckoning was approaching, but he also knew this was just the surface. What still hadn't been publicly revealed was that one of the senior officers who dismissed the signage complaint had ties to a private contracting firm lobbying for military perimeter contracts, and that firm had already bid to replace the signage at Norfolk bases once the scandal broke. That conflict of interest, buried in procurement paperwork and internal memos, was about to be exposed. And when it did, the entire Navy command structure would be forced to answer whether this whole fiasco had really been about a woman on a walk or about the quiet greed and systemic shortcuts that put her in danger to begin with. The Inspector General's report was released on a gray Thursday morning, and it detonated like a controlled explosion through every level of the U.S. Navy, Department of Defense, even the private defense contractor world, exposing not just the procedural failures surrounding Martha Caldwell's wrongful detainment, but also a tangled web of neglected warnings, suppressed reports, and deeply unethical connections between senior officers and external vendors. The 147-page document laid out a timeline so detailed and damning that within hours of its release, news anchors were using phrases like systemic collapse, national embarrassment, and military misconduct at the highest level. The report confirmed the timeline established by Admiral Knox and whistleblower Richard Elkins, stating unequivocally that multiple contractors submitted reports had warned of faulty signage, access control failures, and inadequate patrol coverage around the Truman Dockyard sector. And not only had these warnings been ignored, they had been deliberately suppressed by Commander Preston Hargrove, a senior logistics officer with significant budget authority who, according to the report, redirected repair funding to a series of projects connected to a private security infrastructure firm called Sentinel Shield Technologies. Hargrove had pushed for Sentinel Shield contracts on 2 previous bases and had attended 3 closed-door meetings with the company's executive board within the last calendar year, none of which had been reported through the official disclosure channels. The most shocking revelation came midway through the document, a memo dated for weeks before Martha's incident, in which Hargrove explicitly ordered that all signage complaints be delayed for reconsideration during FY24 planning. Despite knowing the Truman Pier sector had high civilian foot traffic due to its proximity to a recently reopened marina, the memo included the line, "Minor civilian wanderings do not justify perimeter overhaul at this time," a sentence that would go on to appear in every major newspaper the next morning. Public outrage soared, and the calls for accountability came not just from activists and journalists, but from Navy veterans, retired admirals, and even members of Congress, who now demanded a full investigation into all Sentinel Shield contracts and Hargrove's financial dealings. The Department of Defense opened a separate inquiry into procurement ethics, and within 24 hours, Commander Hargrove was suspended without pay and placed under formal review. Back at Martha Caldwell's quiet townhouse, reporters had camped outside. Again, but this time with a very different tone, no longer looking for scandal, but for comment on the vindication they all now acknowledged she deserved. She didn't come outside. She stayed seated in her kitchen with Lisa, clutching a printed copy of the report in trembling hands, reading over the sections that validated everything she had said from the beginning. "So I wasn't invisible," she said softly. "They just didn't care." Lisa, sitting across from her, didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on her phone, where message after message from fellow service members, doctors, and even base commanders poured in with support, apology, and praise. That same afternoon, Admiral Knox held a press briefing outside Naval Station Norfolk, flanked by representatives from the Department of the Navy and the Office of Naval Inspector General. His voice was resolute as he laid out the implementation of the Caldwell Protocol, now formally adopted by the Atlantic Fleet and pending rollout across all U.S. Navy domestic installations. The policy mandated strict signage audits, a new public transparency reporting tool for base perimeter issues, de-escalation training for all military police personnel, and the immediate suspension of arrest procedures for first-time civilian perimeter breaches unless a direct threat was present. Reporters hammered him with questions whether higher brass would face consequences, whether Sentinel Shield would be banned from federal contracts, whether Martha Caldwell would be compensated, but Knox answered only what he could, promising transparency and stating that the Navy owed not just an apology, but a complete cultural correction. "This is not about bad actors," he said firmly. "This is about bad systems that make good people forget what accountability and compassion look like." Meanwhile, the Department of Justice opened a criminal inquiry into Sentinel Shield Technologies, suspecting bid rigging and unlawful lobbying practices across multiple states. Internal emails leaked just days after the IG report showed that Sentinel Shield executives had bragged about placing their guys inside strategic Navy bases and joked about ignoring perimeter weaknesses because someone wandering into a base is free market advertising. That single line ignited fury across the political spectrum, and by the end of the week, multiple senators were calling for a full blacklist of the company from future federal bids. On Capitol Hill, Representative Lillian Ross filed a bill named the Civilian Safety and Military Zones Act, also nicknamed Martha's Law, that would standardize signage protocols and de-escalation policies across all U.S. military branches. When dealing with civilians near sensitive zones, back in Norfolk, however, Martha Caldwell still hadn't stepped into the spotlight. Though hailed as a symbol of quiet resistance and dignity, she remained withdrawn, unsettled by the strange blend of fame and trauma, unable to understand how a morning walk had upended the lives of so many powerful men and women. Lisa urged her to take some comfort in the reforms, but Martha just shook her head and said, "Why did it take all of this for someone to listen?" That question resonated deeply with Knox, who requested to meet Martha privately, not for cameras. Not for statements, but because, as he put it in his personal request, "I owe her a conversation without rank." The meeting happened behind closed doors at the Norfolk Base Chapel, a quiet, neutral space. No uniforms, no aides. Just an older woman in a cardigan and a career Navy man carrying the weight of institutional failure. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table, and Knox looked her in the eye as he apologized, not for the Navy, not for the system, but for not seeing her soon enough. Martha listened quietly, then asked, "Would it have made a difference if I'd been someone important?" Knox didn't flinch. "You were important. The system just forgot that." Outside, the world kept turning, but inside the chapel, something shifted. When Martha walked out, her posture was straighter, her expression more assured, not because she felt avenged, but because, for the first time, someone in command had seen her not as a headline, not as a civilian nuisance, but as a person.
But the storm was not entirely over.
Lieutenant Harper, disgraced and dismissed from his position, filed a wrongful termination suit, claiming he had been unfairly targeted for a culture of silence that went far beyond his station. While his suit was not expected to succeed, it did dredge up further documentation of base-wide negligence, adding to pressure for broader reform. At the same time, Sentinel Shield Technologies' CEO was subpoenaed to testify before the House Oversight Committee and was rumored to be negotiating a deal in exchange for naming military officials who had facilitated contract steering. That scandal loomed like a second wave, threatening to take down names much higher than Hargrove or Harper. Knox, anticipating the fallout, preemptively submitted a list of recommendations to the Pentagon on how to permanently wall off procurement from command influence. In the midst of all this chaos, Martha received a quiet letter, no fanfare. No cameras from a group of Navy wives stationed across the country. Inside were handwritten notes, each one thanking her for standing up, for speaking out, for unintentionally doing what so many had long feared to do, questioned the authority that had gone unchecked. "You made us visible," one note said. Martha cried for the first time in weeks. The story had begun with handcuffs, silence, and fear, but it was slowly becoming one of voice, reform, and unexpected courage. Yet one final chapter remained. One last revelation that would tie all the strands together, not with a courtroom twist or political theater, but with a simple connection that no one had noticed: an overlooked piece of documentation, buried deep in a naval review folder marked Archived Access Complaints. It was a maintenance ticket from nearly a year ago, filed by a junior seaman named Eric Dalton, describing the exact same Truman Pier signage issue and recommending urgent replacement after his own mother nearly walked through the gate during a family visit. The ticket was marked unnecessary, civilian engagement risk minimal, and closed without action. The date: 11 months before Martha Caldwell's walk. The officer who closed the ticket: Preston Hargrove, the ignored civilian. Another mother. Another near miss. Another opportunity lost. The cycle had repeated because no one had listened, not then, not until it was too late. But now, with the world watching and a new standard being born, the question hung in the air. Would they finally listen now? 6 weeks after the Inspector General's report rocked the Navy and government, oversight bodies began reshaping their security expectations nationwide. Martha Caldwell stood alone on the same waterfront path where it had all begun, her fingers curled lightly around the handle of a cane she didn't need, but had grown used to carrying since that morning when her wrists were left bruised and her heart rattled by the cold bite of handcuffs. The breeze was gentle now, salty and warm, a far cry from the thick tension that had once surrounded this stretch of dock where warning signs now stood bold, clear, and impossible to miss. Installed under the new regulations established by the Caldwell Protocoler, set of reforms that had not only transformed base security across every U.S. Navy installation, but had also become a rallying point for wider military policy change involving civilian rights, signage enforcement, and de-escalation measures. Though Martha was never one to seek attention, she couldn't escape the impact of what her ordeal had started. Congressional hearings continued, with subpoenas reaching as far as the Pentagon. And Sentinel Shield Technologies had not only been stripped of its federal contracts, but was now the subject of a joint DOJ and SEC investigation for bidrigging, falsified lobbying disclosures, and undisclosed ties to senior military procurement officers. Commander Hargrove had been dishonorably discharged and was awaiting federal indictment. Lieutenant Harper's wrongful termination suit had been quietly dismissed. His attorney withdrawing after the whistleblower testimonies proved his awareness of the signage risks and his deliberate refusal to act. Public pressure had forced the Department of Defense to commit to an independent civilian oversight committee for base access procedures. And Martha's law, spearheaded by Representative Lillian Ross, had passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support, guaranteeing that every military perimeter accessible by or near public areas must be clearly marked, documented, and audited quarterly by an independent review panel. It wasn't just a win, it was a transformation. Yet through it all, Martha never called herself brave. In interviews, she simply said, "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I only spoke up because my daughter told me I mattered." Lisa Caldwell, now promoted and newly assigned to a policy advisory role within the Navy's Civil Affairs Division, used her platform to advocate for other military family members whose civilian relatives often felt invisible within the system. "What happened to my mother wasn't an accident," she said during a televised panel on veterans' families. "It was the result of a system that forgot people exist beyond protocol. We can do better, and we will." At the Norfolk base, Admiral Knox stepped down 6 months after the scandal, not in disgrace but in resolve, submitting his early retirement with a final message. Delivered to every commanding officer under his jurisdiction, courage is not about battle, it's about ownership. If we can't take responsibility for who we fail, then we don't deserve to lead. His resignation letter was later read aloud at a Navy ethics conference and included in military leadership training modules as a case study in moral command. Martha, who had refused offers for book deals, documentaries, and political endorsements, finally agreed to one televised interview. 1 hour-long special in which she sat with a soft-spoken journalist in her modest kitchen and recounted everything, from her walk to the interrogation, to the Admiral's apology, to the moment she realized her fear had become a national reckoning. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said. "But if something good came out of it, maybe that's enough." The broadcast aired to millions. Letters poured in. Some from military families. Some from survivors of wrongful detainments. Some from women her age who said they had walked quietly all their lives and never imagined someone like them could spark change. But the most powerful letter came weeks later, handwritten in blue ink and postmarked from a rural base in Idaho. It read, "My mom walked onto a base 2 years ago by mistake. They yelled at her. She cried for days. She never told anyone except me. But she watched your story and said, 'Now they know what it's like. Thank you.'" Martha read it over and over again, then folded it gently and placed it in a drawer beside the picture of her late husband, a Navy mechanic who'd passed away decades earlier. She whispered, "I hope you're proud." And though she would never say it out loud, something inside her had changed forever. She still walked the waterfront path, but now she carried herself differently, not with bitterness, not with pride, but with quiet certainty that even in the vast machinery of government and uniform, one voice, one step, one accidental moment can ripple out and make the system tremble. And maybe, just maybe, it can make it better. So if you ever wonder whether your voice matters, whether what you've seen or suffered or endured will ever change anything, remember this simple truth. They handcuffed a woman for walking where she wasn't supposed to, but she walked right into history. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel for more powerful true stories that expose the hidden truths behind everyday moments. Your next walk might just change the world.